Hello and welcome to your daily game sizzle with me, Jon Jordan. Today I'm wearing my Mario hat because we are looking at Nintendo's financials, specifically the third quarter of Switch. So Switch has been out for 3 quarters now, and we've got a better look at how the console is performing. And as I've done in the past, I'm looking at how Switch has performed compared to the 3DS, which was Nintendo's last handheld console to be released, and the Wii U, which was Nintendo's last home console to be released. And the reason these two are interesting is not just they were the last consoles Nintendo released, but because Switch is a dual-use console. So it can be used in home console mode with your TV or in portable mode. So it gives a good comparison for us. So look at our first graph, only 2 graphs today. So we can see I've split this into columns and lines just to make it simpler. So with the columns, we have the first 3 quarters of shipments for the 3DS in green, the Wii U in blue, and the Switch in red. So we can see Q1 3DS shipped the most, followed by Wii, and Switch was in 3rd place there. When it comes to Q2, significant change. Switch has become the most shipped console of the 3. 3DS has increased and Wii hasn't really increased at all. And then we can see that trend is further seen in the Q3 graph, where Wii basically at that point was already a failure, had stopped selling. 3DS was selling well, increased, but Switch outsold them all. So where are we with Switch? We're 7.4 million units shipped. So that's into Japan, about 2 million. What Nintendo calls the Americas, and then other, which is mainly Europe. So we can see where we are now. Switch has been very successful. We kind of all know the stories. Basically, certainly in Japan, Nintendo hasn't produced enough, but kind of globally in the US as well, Switch is in short supply. In Europe, it's actually not so bad. You can get Switches quite easily. But in large parts of its key markets, it is supply constrained. So there's more demand than there is supply, which is in some ways a good position to be in, but in other ways, if that keeps happening, and it has really been happening now for all those 3 quarters, Nintendo isn't making as much money as it could. So it's desperately looking to increase production. So we had lots of rumours about how much production of Switch will be increased really from now into 2018. And that's kind of what we come to see with these graphs. So when we come to the line, I've just drawn lines into the future for Switch at least, so it makes it easy to see. So we can see with a Wii U there, not a lot happened. It kind of grew slowly, and if you see on the far right hand side, there's a big blue dot, and that's Wii U's lifetime total of shipped consoles, just under 14 million. So that was a disaster really for Nintendo. We can see there are looks maybe complicated, but not really. There's 2 shades of red for Switch. So we've got one dot that says original prediction, and that was Nintendo's original prediction for how many Switches it would ship in its financial year ending 31st of March 2018. It originally predicted 10 million Switches would be shipped. A bit of a tongue twister. It's since updated that prediction, which is something everyone did expect. As we said, there's been lots of rumours about production and how much it would be increased. So Nintendo has increased that by 4 million. So now it thinks in that 12-month period ending March 2018, it will ship 14 million. Which would give a total of 16.7 million Switches shipped in the first 15 months. In the first 5 quarters in the first 15 months. So Switch shipped 2.7 million units in its first quarter. So we can see that would actually take Switch very close to the 15-month total of the 3DS. So we can see the 3DS. 3DS is interesting as well because it shipped pretty much the same time in the year as Switch. So both of those consoles shipped in March, whereas the Wii U actually shipped in the holiday season. So it launched very well and then had not a lot happened after that. So the biggest quarter for any console clearly is the 3 months ending 31st of December, because that's the holiday season. That's when people buy presents. So particularly for Nintendo consoles, that's a very strong time for it. So it is interesting, even though Nintendo has increased its predicted shipments for Switch, it was very conservative with the original 10 million. We're not quite sure. Some people still think it's being quite conservative with this 14 million in the year. If it is increasing production or can get production up to 2 million a month, so 6 million a quarter as expected, it could actually beat that number. So it could outship 3DS. 3DS actually in its first 5 quarters shipped 15 million units. So that's 17 million units, 17.1. So that's the target to beat. It would only have to go up. Switch could easily ship like 1 million more, I think, if they can sort out their production. So we may see Switch outselling 3DS over that period. Okay, so we've discussed the hardware shipments of Switch, all going very well there. But let's have a look, potentially the more interesting comparison, and this is the tie ratio. So the tie ratio is the number of games sold per console sold. So effectively, how many games on average has someone who's bought a console gone out and bought? And that's much more interesting, at least in terms of Nintendo's financials, because that's a better idea of profitability. So consoles may have a small profit margin, maybe 10% margin on them. As the console gets older and companies get better at manufacturing them, more efficient, then that margin can increase. But you don't make much money on consoles. You do make a lot of money on software, obviously. Margin can be anything up to 50%, really. So this is the tie ratio. Again, same kind of setup on the graph. So we can see that actually, even though Switch didn't sell many consoles, it actually had, at launch at least, in its launch period, the first 2 years, had quite a high tie ratio. Now, this is not really surprising. Home consoles always have a higher tie ratio than handheld consoles. That's partly because they're better supported with more high-profile software, and partly because it's a different buying pattern. People with handhelds, they're happy to just have one game or a couple of games a year, whereas obviously home consoles are much more about consuming content. So we can see in their equivalent Q1s, 3DS sold about 2.5 games in its launch quarter. Wii U sold almost 3, and Switch was actually low. Actually sold 2. There wasn't a lot of games at launch. Actually, there were only about 2 or 3, so no big surprise there. When it comes to Q3, we can see obviously they all increase. What tends to happen over time is tie ratios increase. That's a tendency, but in launch periods it can go up and down a little bit depending on what games are released during the launch period and the supply of hardware. So we can actually see that 3DS shot up, Wii stayed about the same in its Q2, and the Switch shot up as well, almost jumping from 2 to 3 games bought per console. And then again in Q3, we see 3DS actually drop down. That was because there are a lot more consoles being bought at that point, and people weren't going out and buying the games that had been released. So you kind of have, as a console goes more mass market in its launch, its tie ratio tends to weaken. That's one of the reasons that Wii U had such a strong tie ratio, was it just wasn't selling much hardware. So the people who had it liked it and were buying a lot of games, but it wasn't going into the mass market who might buy just 1 or 2 games. So you can actually see, if you look all the way through, Wii U had a tie ratio of goes up to 5, approaching 6 by the end of the second year. With 3DS as a handheld console, it increased and then kind of dropped back a little bit as it approached its second year. So, but under 3 games per 3DS sold at all those points. And like I say, this is what we'd expect. Traditionally, if you look at Nintendo consoles, the average tie ratio for its home consoles is about 8, and the average for its handhelds is about 5. So where are we with Switch at the moment? Well, with Switch we're about 3.6. Now that current guidance, that big red dot, again, that's based on Nintendo's guidance of how many hardware units it will ship and also how many software units it will ship. So it has increased the software guidance. It did think it was going to ship 35 million games in that 12-month period ending the 31st of March 2018. It now thinks it will ship 50. But because it's also increased the hardware guidance, then actually this tie ratio doesn't change very much because both those two things have increased. And it thinks it's going to be about 3.3. So by Q5, by 15 months into Switch's lifetime, which will be the quarter ending the 31st of March 2018, Nintendo thinks it will have sold about 3.3 games per Switch. Again, we could suggest that's a little bit conservative potentially in terms of guidance, partly because Switch has actually had pretty strongly supported launch. So it launched with Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. That was followed up by Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which was a remake of a Wii U game but sold very well in the States. Then we had Splatoon 2, which sold very well in Japan. ARMS, which has sold okay, done over 1 million, which is a new IP, so that was, I think Nintendo was quite happy with that. And now we just had Super Mario Odyssey come out as well, and that's selling very fast. So we have, if you think about it, we have a Mario game, a Mario Kart game, and a Zelda game, and a Splatoon game. So those are 4 very strong IPs. You could argue they are Nintendo's strongest IPs to have in a launch window. So those are not going to be coming. Those, we're not going to have a Mario game, we're not going to have a Splatoon game, we're not going to have those games again next year. We may have some DLC, so we've got some download expansions for the Zelda game coming out this year. That means, I think, during the period we're looking at now, these 5 quarters, we could see the tie ratio actually higher, but then it may be a bit weaker during the second year. But nevertheless, I think we can say that Switch, in terms of hardware and software, is doing very well, better than Nintendo expected, which is why Nintendo share price is up such a lot. But I guess the kind of big, not the big, but the kind of medium-term question, I guess, that I'm still asking is, will Switch end up being used as a home console or a handheld console? Because there are quite different end games for those. Home consoles tend to sell less, handhelds sell more, so only 2 of Nintendo's home consoles have sold over 50 million units lifetime, whereas all of its handhelds have sold over 50 million lifetime. And as we've discussed, but home consoles have a much higher tie ratio and then handhelds. So we're actually in this interesting state at the moment where Switch is selling like a handheld. It's selling very well, but its tie ratio is more like a home console. So that's really good for Nintendo. Nintendo actually has given some usage data. So it said 30% of usage for the Switch units is purely handheld, or 80% of the time handheld, and only 18% of the time is mainly used as a home console. So anecdotally, I think that's what we will see. We will see Switch being used more as a handheld unit. Obviously, there's still a big chunk of time, over 50% of time, where it's a dual use thing. I imagine over time you'll probably see Switch become more of a handheld. Whether that means it will continue this trend of selling very well like a handheld unit, and the tie ratio staying high, we'll have to wait and see. It definitely could do that because it is this dual use kind of thing, and it is getting a lot of software support now from third parties as well, so that will help the tie ratio. So at the moment, definitely the best of both worlds for Nintendo. Again, in the long term, the other interesting thing to see will be what does Nintendo do with 3DS. So 3DS is still selling well, but at some point over the next 2-3 years, that's going to drop off. So does Nintendo then release another handheld, or does it now move from what was a 2-product ecosystem where it had a home console and a handheld console? Is the future just Switch? It just has one, because obviously that has implications as well for its financial long term. But at the moment, everything in Nintendo's garden is rosy. So thanks for watching the video. This is your daily game sizzle, where we do these videos about what's going on in the world of games, particularly some of these financial and data drops, which we go into some detail. So if that's your kind of thing, don't forget to subscribe. But thanks for watching this one, and hope to see you again soon.